So I sent out the email. So I just say before I start. So if people have trouble hearing me, raise your hand so I know, and I'll try and talk louder. I have a tendency to die away, and this room is a little cavernous, and we got fans going. And so if you can't hear me, just raise your hand, and I'll be looking around, and hopefully I'll see you and step it up a little bit. Use my outside voice. So I chose this topic on Wednesday, and yesterday, Thursday, my son's best friend died unexpectedly at the age of 27. He had pretty severe cerebral palsy. I don't know exactly why he died. There was no particular medical problem, unusual medical problem for him, but that's been the focus of my last day and a half. So as I was sitting here doing what those of you who have given talks up here may have had this experience, or other places too, that when you're meditating before the talk, your meditation there's a lot of chatter going on in your mind about what you're going to say. And I was reflecting about impermanence and the way that it's connected to my topic. And I think that the way that it's connected is that it really pinpoints the importance of the opportunity that we have to practice and to penetrate these very deep teachings that Buddhism provides to be able to understand who we truly are. And that we don't, will's passing is just a reminder for me in a way that we don't know when we're going to leave, when this particular life will be over. So we need to pay attention. And I think that the question of who we are is so central. For all of us, we're always trying to figure out, who am I? What's my purpose in life? And I started out when I was thinking about this, I think I started to think about this topic because I'm leading a meditation group at Capitol Lakes. It's a very eclectic group of people at the retirement community there who come to the meditation. Not all of them, in fact, most of them don't think of themselves as Buddhist in any way. They learn meditation from various places. And so I naturally bring in Buddhist concepts, and this was one concept that I got a lot of pushback about what do you mean that I don't have a self, that my self is not real? I mean, my self is really important, my memories are important, my life is important. And I think that was helpful to me to okay, there's something here that's not obvious. So that's how I started thinking about this. And Susan O'Leary was talking on Tuesday about Dogen, who's I forget what century he lived in, but he was an early Zen teacher in Japan, one of the founders of the Soto lineage in Japan. And one of his most famous quotes goes like this: "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. To be enlightened by all things is to remove the barriers between oneself and others." So, why do we want to study the self? I mean, I think to some degree it's because that's, as I said, we're always asking this question about who we are. So we're always studying the self, even before we encounter any real kind of religious practice. But I think that there's also, if we think of ourselves as being connected to Buddhism or being Buddhist, in some way, we're hearing all the time from our teachers that there's some sense in which our self is illusory, and that this sense of self, this clinging to ourself, is somehow the source of our suffering. And when I reflected on that, I thought, that feels to me a little bit intuitive, but maybe that's just because I've been hanging around Buddhists for a long time now. So let me run it by you, what it feels like to me. When we are suffering, if we listen to the way we talk about our suffering, we'll hear the word I a lot. I remember noticing this. I was talking to a person who was going through a divorce, a breakup of a relationship, and they were talking about their marriage, and all the sentences that they said all had the word I in them, about how I need this, and I want that, and I'm not getting this other thing, and he doesn't treat me well. There was always some way in which I played a part in the conversation. And that's not to say that there's nothing real about any of those perceptions. But it is interesting to notice how there's some relationship between our suffering. That when we are suffering the most, that I is a very powerful presence. We had a full day retreat at Holy Wisdom this spring, and I was teaching about happiness. And I pointed out then that when we are happy, we feel very expansive and open. And in contrast, when we're unhappy, we feel contracted. And I think that what we're contracted around is this sense of self. So it's somewhat intuitive, at least to me, what our teachers say, that there seems to be some relationship between our suffering and this sense of self. So in order to follow the way, in order to follow the path towards freedom, whether we view that from a Buddhist perspective or not, there is some way in which we must study the self. When we practice meditation, we always start out by doing some type of practice, some type of concentration or awareness practice. In Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition, in Thay's tradition, we're taught to be aware of our breath going in and out. And in some of these practices, the way this is expressed is we're asked to be aware of the sensations in our body as if from the inside out. I want to talk about that for a minute. So just put your hand out in front of yourself and just look at it and focus on your hand. Now, if you pay attention to what that feels like, you'll notice that there's a strong sense of you looking at your hand. So there's a you and there's a hand. So now just let your hand rest on your lap. And instead of looking at your hand, just feel the sensations of the aliveness in your hand from inside your hand. And those sensations don't need you to be paying attention to them to be there. So you can feel those sensations from the inside out. And there's some way in which they're not, that they're independent of this you, this I. They're just happening, emerging somehow. And when we're aware of these sensations from the inside out, there's some way in which we're unhooking from this I that we were a minute ago focusing on our hand with. And we're somehow experiencing, allowing this experience, being present to this experience, without the necessity of that I even being there. So I've been reading this book by a teacher named Locke Kelly called Shifting into Freedom. And he talks about something he calls ego identification. He says ego identification feels like you are a mini-me located in your head that looks out of your body's eyes. I think that you may have experienced a little bit of that when you were just focusing on your hand. That was that mini-me, that self. Now, it's interesting because I found for a number of years now that I actually, in the same way that I can feel those sensations of my hand from the inside out, I can notice this sense of this mini-me. There's some way to be aware of this sense of a me. And it's interesting because when we do that, it's hard to know, well, who is being aware of it? What is being aware of it? Who is this? What is this awareness? Let me read a section from Locke Kelly's book about how we create this ego identification and how ego identification creates suffering. Let me first explain. He talks about the boundary survival program, and what he's talking about is our natural biological urge to defend our physically separate bodies from threats to its existence. So he writes, our suffering begins when ego identification mistakes itself as a real physical entity and then looks outside for nourishment. Because ego identification is a mental construction and not a living creature. It doesn't need food, nor does it need to be fearful or protected, because it is only a pattern of thought and cannot be hurt. However, when ego identification believes it is the physical creature, I, that has a boundary, it uses the biological survival programs of our ego functions and constantly feels unfulfilled cravings and worries about imaginary potential dangers. The boundary survival program is designed to serve the physical body. As soon as self-awareness creates ego identification as a location, it syncs up with the biological boundary program to crave, seek, possess, and consume. These drives are natural and useful at the physical level, but they create suffering at the level of identity. Nothing can relieve the mistaken identity's desires, resulting in a perpetual feeling of lack, fear, and dissatisfaction. The attempt to solve this feeling of dissatisfaction through seeking from ego identification reinforces the problem. Ego identification is driven to be constantly seeking, which makes us feel like something is always missing, that who we are and whatever is happening is never quite enough or right. This is the root of suffering. that can be relieved by awakening. When ego identification co-opts the body's survival strategies to defend its illusory identity, it builds a fortress around itself for protection and then feels isolated. Ego identification perpetually tries to solve problems that are not real, and then, not succeeding, it feels more anxious and develops more strategies. A set of defensive attitudes and patterns of behavior multiply to preserve its perceived existence. When self-awareness identifies with our boundary survival program, we contract our natural boundless nature and feel as if all our life energy is being squeezed into a narrow point of view. Identification with this narrow point of view severely limits us and obscures our connection to the larger and subtler dimensions of life. Our brain, driven by the mini-me, is constantly on alert for potential danger, often ending up overwhelmed, anxious, or depressed. So I was curious what Thich Nhat Hanh had to say about this, and I found this wonderful little video clip where he's answering a question from somebody who is coming to a retreat. And the questioner asked, essentially, was a longer form of the question, who am I? How do I think about myself? And this is what Thai said. When Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he means that while he is thinking, he is the thinking. The Buddha said, the thinking is going on, but there is no I behind it. If there is a painful feeling, you can say there is a painful feeling going on. As for the feeler, that's not sure. When we say it is raining, the rain is sure, but there is no rainer. You don't need a rainer for rain. You don't need a thinker for thoughts, or a feeler for feelings. If you look deeply, you can see that your body is a stream. All parents and ancestors are there, but the one, that myself, is not sure. There is a continuation with ancestors, even back to animals and minerals. They are obvious. The person behind is not sure. The notion of a separate self is a kind of tunnel that you keep going in. If you practice meditation and you see that there is the breathing and no breather, sitting but no sitter, then that tunnel will vanish and there is a lot of space and a lot of freedom. So I think I'll stop there so we have time for discussion. So it's our practice in this community during our discussions that it's a kind of circle practice. And so when we wish to speak, we simply put our palms together and bow to the community, and the community bows back. And then we have the floor for as long as we need to speak from our heart about either the topic of the evening or whatever is up for us in our lives or our practice. And when we're done speaking, so that allows some time for silence because we don't lose the floor if we stop talking. And but we'll know that you're done when you bow again to the community and let us know that you're done. So I'm done. And it's your turn. So thank you for listening.
I really liked thinking about the topic of no self, and I think there's a real lot of little subtle teachings in understanding it, and kind of an image that I've come to associate with like self and no self that's helpful for me is thinking about like a somewhat rushing stream with a whirlpool here and there. And I think that what we think of as the self has a lot of similarity to the whirlpool, because if you try to say, there is the self, there is the whirlpool. Well, like between now and now, it's not the same water. It doesn't stay exactly the same. Things are simply passing through. You can't isolate it and say that is the whirlpool, because it's just an energetic something that's the result of the past moving along, and at the moment there it is. Because as I've read more about the concept of no self, it's not saying that. The main part about it is that there's no isolated, unique self that's absolutely you and nobody else. It's all about intervening, like the quote from Dogen, you study further and then you realize it's all intervening. But then, so like with the whirlpool, even though you realize that there's no isolated permanent aspect to it, on the other hand, there is a whirlpool there. There is a swirl of water, and you can look at it, and it has shapes, and it, grabs a stick and spits it out, and has some sort of an existence. And so I think self has that too, where there's something about it that, at any given moment, seems to have an effect on other parts of the world. And so it's both there and not there. It has some presence, and yet it isn't a permanent presence that you could in any way pinpoint. And I think that too is one of the things I like about it, is that it, in order to understand it, it forces you to accept the existence of two sort of contradictory things simultaneously being true, which you can't, in a way, accept in a rational, write it down on a piece of paper sort of way, and yet you can know it's really true, and you can't really say what that means, but you somehow know. So I like that lack of clarity.
I've actually begun to think that the whole practice is about ego dissolution. That is the main purpose of practice. And of course, when, as has been said, when the volume of self is low, you feel more open and expansive and less contracted. And when it's high, and the self or the ego, not the self, but the ego is front and center, there's usually some happiness present. I have found a couple of things really helpful with this, and that is, you pointed out this person was always using I. To me, I found it very helpful, rather than saying, I am angry, I am afraid, I am depressed, it's just to say, anger is happening, fear is happening. holding these two things at once is very important. And I think another part of the practice is the ability to live with ambiguity and mystery and non-duality, and to have paradox disappear as a result of that. So
Yeah, thank you for taking on this topic. I appreciated his teaching, and I think he talked about the same thing that everyone has commented on. Kai says we need non-self to get away from the sense of self, and that's an important vehicle. But he says you can get more stuck in non-self than in self, which is a great point. And I think that Dogen has seen that with the culminating himself. I think Dogen actually says exactly that. I pulled that out again. To study the ways to study the self, and to study the self is to predict the self. And to predict the self is to be enlightened by all things. And to be enlightened by all things is to remove the barriers between oneself and others. And it's that exact paradox. And it's you can't get stuck in non-self either. So I appreciated your visuals about that as well, for the ambiguity of that, and that we are in constant change.
Sorry to hear about the death. Your sense, I found just personally that this breath practice, that the breath is non-self. It's not separate from it. And it also is separate self at the same time. But just by becoming one with the breath, even for a moment, we touch into that. And so it's available moment to moment, all the time. It's not something that we have to go and sit in a cave for 10 years and meditate to try to get to. It's right here. And we can sort of hear that and understand it, and to actually embody it is simply to let go of distractions and just be with the breath. And that's it. So simple. So I'm really impressed with our Sangha that we have these practitioners who are studying this ardently. And so thank you for We're bringing it up.
Practicing together. Cultivating awareness and a sense of where we're going with our lives. The true home, the true destination. Through this practice, through this community, we create great merit. And now we give it away to support the wisdom, the enlightenment of all beings, all the suffering beings. May they find their way to their true home. May they find true happiness. So, time for announcements. So, do you want to grab the newsletter by you and let us know what's coming up?
What's today? And the 21st on Sunday, Molly Krochuk and Morris Young are hosting. And Tuesday, the 23rd, it's Lisa, the topic You Are Not Alone. And on Wednesday, it is Breathe, You Are Alive. And then next Friday, Susan O'Leary will be talking about substance.
And I should also say, too, that we have a flyer for our retreat. I'm not sure we have too many to give away, but at least you can look at the dates and some of the information, and you can find a link to the flyer on our website. It's October 14 to 16 or something. So, and that's in a beautiful location at Bethel Horizons Retreat Center near Dodgeville. Just Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday morning. And Sherry, you're helping lead that. Sherry and Jack Lawler from Evanston, Illinois, will be leading it. So anything else? So I should say that there's a basket there on the bench. If you are able to leave $2 to help defray our expenses, that would be helpful. In addition, people are welcome to stay after our closing circle to meet other people and to talk to each other. And particular strong invitation to folks who are new to get to know us. And so now we'll form a closing circle. We won't go all the way around the edge of the room because our arms don't reach that far, but whatever size will work for us to hold each other's hands, and we'll have the opportunity to say the names of those who may have died or are suffering, anything that we want to remember, and give particular energy to as a community. So let's form our circle. So I'll mention again Will Simmons, who died unexpectedly in your sleep early Thursday morning.
I like to put my baby sister Allison in the circle, who died 4 weeks ago tonight. I like to put Paul, my son, and Dharma in the circle.
My friends James and Yvette were dealing with a very scary cancer diagnosis.
And I also want to mention Will's family and also my son, who are all suffering a lot from this passing.
I want to mention my friend Megan, who passed 3 weeks ago.
Thank you for coming.
Hey,
Yeah.
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 Timely decision, I think.
Yeah. Well, hard to find the time when it's not.
It's true.
But